I'm looking in the chat and the meeting is being recorded. So good. Okay, Andrew's sorted. Excellent. Well, I'm really thrilled to be taking part in this. And I mean, I have given a few talks recently, but this one's a bit special. So I've already confessed to having been an undergraduate in Oxford. I won't say any more than that at this stage, but I also grew up in Aylesbury. So, you know, just down the road and kind of part of your patch. And as third thing, as Maura and Rosa and I've been talking, I'm a huge fan of Marketta's work and happy to and honoured to regard her as a friend as well as a kindred spirit. So this is, for all these reasons and more, I'm really pleased to be here. I will share my screen and let's get going. There we go. So I'm going to be, yes, really talking a whistle-stop tour of my book. And towns and cities, you'll see the brackets there. I use the kind of US idea of cities as anything with more than a few hundred people in it. But of course, in the UK, we tend to speak of towns and cities. But I hope you'll see the relevance of my work to lots of urban contexts. But when we're thinking about children's relationship with the places where they live, I think it's a good idea to think about our own childhoods, as the organisers have just invited us to do, and to reflect on that experience. So I'm going to do a quick sort of historical starting point, and this is image 1.1 from my book, and what it's showing you is what you might call the roaming range or the home territory of 4 8-year-old children, but they're in different generations of the same family and they all grew up in the same city. So you can see the big blob that takes up most of the map, about 6 miles across. That's the roaming range of the great-grandfather at the age of 8 in this family. And then you can see how the roaming ranges shrink. And then this yellow dot that you can see up here on the top left, that's the roaming range of the son in this family. And in fact, we know that he's allowed to go to the end of his street, as you can maybe read. Most 8-year-old children are really not allowed beyond the shadows that are cast by their own homes. So I think what this brings into sharp relief is what I call the shrinking horizons of childhood. And I think it's one of the most profound and underexplored changes in the nature of children's lives. And it's one kind of strand through the book and my ideas. Now, there's a lot of reasons why this change has happened, but one of them is about the way we build or shape the habitats where the young of our species grow up. And if we think about that appetite for experience that we can all see in children and that was brought out in that first image of the kids on the tree, and then we ask ourselves, what's our standard response to that appetite for experience? I'm sorry to say that all too often it looks something like this. Okay, not always quite as bad as this, but really we need to do a much better job. I'm sure you agree. So I'm going to be looking in more detail at this idea of child-friendly urban planning, why I think it matters, a few examples from cities, including in the UK, but mainly beyond the UK, that have taken the idea seriously, touching on UK policy and practice, and then some thoughts about making it happen at the end. I think I've got about 20 minutes more, something like that. So just to say that I was lucky enough to get some funding to visit and study about a dozen cities in some detail. These are all cities, they're not necessarily child-friendly right now, but they have taken the goal of making their built fabric work better for children seriously. And I'm going to just touch on a few of those cities in my talk. So let's get a little bit of a definition. When thinking about what makes neighbourhoods work for families in the round, this is drawing on the work of Brent Toderian, who's a former chief planner in Vancouver and a champion of family-friendly neighbourhoods, especially in high-density downtown contexts. But he talks about there being 3 pillars, and one is housing. So housing of the right size. If you don't have enough bedrooms, then it's game over. Also services for families, schools, childcare, health, and so on. But it's this third pillar, the public realm, that I'm most interested in and that my book focuses on, because this is when children kind of step outside of their role as, as offspring or as members of a school, and kind of stake their claim as citizens and really start to live their lives in public. So that's my focus. By the way, there's a sort of historical interest in this topic. It's not very salient right now, I think we'd agree, but there have been points in urban planning's past where planners, designers, architects have been very interested in children's experience of place. And here's an image from the Biker estate in Newcastle, where there's some really fascinating historical work showing just how much time and attention the planners and architects gave to children's worlds and lives. But we're not there. When we're thinking about what makes something a place child-friendly, I draw heavily on Marketta's work. You'll hear more about that in a minute, but this essentially that there are two dimensions to a child-friendly place. And this diagram hopefully brings that out. And one dimension is a kind of fairly obvious. It's sort of stuff to do, it's things to do. So play spaces, leisure, sports, nature, you can see your friends. So that's the things to do dimension. But there's a second dimension, which is the vertical one here, which is children's mobility. How easy is it for children to get around their neighborhood, crucially on their own? And it's only where you have both a lot of choice, affordances to use Marketta's term, and you have high levels of child mobility that you're in that child-friendly quadrant. And this framework runs right through my book. It's really the beating heart of the book. So to give you a flavor of what this looks like, I'm going to briefly describe what I offer in the book as a kind of ultimate child-friendly neighborhood. And that is the eco-suburb of Voba in Freiburg, well known amongst sustainable urban planners and designers. So this is a district of about 5,000 or 6,000 people. You can see from the aerial there, it's apartment living, it's medium density, mixed use, but it's really when you get down to street level that the difference and the key characteristics of Voba come to light, because the area is in essence car-free, very low levels of car ownership, and any families that do own a car have to store their car in one of a number of peripheral car parks. So this means that the whole of the space between the buildings is available for public use, for social use, for play, and so on. So just a few images. This is a nice image of one of the green spaces, very green, attractively landscaped, but you can see there aren't really very many playgrounds. In fact, I'd say there aren't any playgrounds in Voba. The play features are kind of woven throughout the outdoor space, as you can see here, and very well positioned so that there's informal oversight with the housing. Here's an image of one of the streets. Not surprisingly, high levels of walking and cycling because of the absence of traffic. A couple more images. I've been lucky enough to visit Voban twice over the years, and each time, really, it's been amazing to see the levels of use, the activity, the numbers of people being out and about in the outdoor space. And here you can just see, here's one of the car parks, and also great public transport to connect the district to the city. So the building blocks that you see in Voban that I look at in the book are simple, really. It's streets, walking and cycling networks, public space, and housing. But I hope you can see with each of those building blocks the kind of features that make them child-friendly. So in the book, I try and pull together a sort of idealized schematic that captures some of the key qualities of Voban, slightly elaborated. I'm not going to talk to this diagram now. It's available, it'll be available for you afterwards, but really a lot of it is what you call basic progressive sustainable urban planning and design. But then there's a kind of child-friendly layer on top around the play features, social space, sports, and so on. So that's the image I want. It's a lighthouse, if you like, that I want you to have in your mind. The direction of travel, I think that all developments need to be going in if we take the goal seriously of becoming more child friendly. Why does this idea matter? Well, when I visited the cities and talked to city leaders, what emerged was that there were three main rationales or kind of drivers behind their interest in this topic. And so one group of cities had a strong focus on children's rights, children's health, children's well-being. So it was a strongly child-centered approach. Then there was a second group of cities that really saw the connection between making somewhere child-friendly and making it more sustainable. And Voba's a really powerful illustration of that. So what they were grasping was that if we ask ourselves what a child-friendly neighborhood looks like, well, it's compact, it's green, it's easy to get around. So it looks a lot like a sustainable neighborhood. And so there's a really strong connections and win-wins there. But then there's a third group of cities who actually had quite hard-nosed economic reasons for being interested in this idea, that they could see that, in short, a city that is not able to attract and retain families over the long term is a city whose long-term economic future is bleak. And I'll come back to the example of Rotterdam in a minute. But just to unpack some of these rationales a bit more, it gives me no pleasure at all. I'm ashamed to tell you I'm speaking from London, where a few months back there was a groundbreaking legal case, a coroner's inquest that ruled that 9-year-old Ella Adu Kissi Debra died as a result of air pollution caused in part, of course, by poor planning. And Ella's family lived meters away from the South Circular Road in London. And there are other environmental threats, of course, that are ultimately to do with poor planning, the most obvious of which is road danger. And that image that you can see there is a way, I think, of bringing out how much we've kind of normalized the threat from traffic. But even in countries that we think have a good record on public health, such as Sweden, 1 in 9 of the children who die every year over the age of 5 in Sweden, they're dying as a result of road danger. And there's a strong social gradient for this, and indeed for many other environmental consequences of poor planning. Turning to a slightly more positive note, we're getting good evidence now that children who play out more, who have better opportunities for outdoor play, actually have higher levels of subjective well-being. This is a study across a dozen or more countries showing really significant differences in the subjective happiness scores of children who can play regularly versus children who can't. And turning to the mobility side of the model here, this is some work on children's mobility that shows, again, a strong link between those countries that where children have high levels of independent mobility and those that and their subsequent happiness levels. And on the other hand, countries with low mobility, children have low happiness levels. And if I'm not mistaken, Marketta might have been involved in the study, and you can see Finland there is at the top right of that graph. Then there's growing evidence of the connection between children playing out in neighborhoods, especially in housing developments, and a more widespread, wider public use by other groups of the community in spending time in public space. So this is some studies by Dinah Bornat, who sadly couldn't join us today, but who's really a champion of this, one of the Mayor of London's design advisors, showing that connection between children's activity out of doors and adults. If we ask ourselves what children themselves tell us about what they like and don't like, their answers are surprisingly clear and consistent. And this is based on work around the world. And I argue that actually what they're telling us maps very clearly onto this two-dimensional child-friendly framework that I've already described. So if we pull all this together, we get an idea that's encapsulated in a nice quote from Enrique Peñalosa, the former mayor of Bogota, who talks about children being a kind of indicator species. And I take this literally. Again, think of Voba. The presence of children of different ages, with and without their parents, being active and visible in the public realm is a sign of the quality of a human habitat, in the same way that the presence of salmon is a sign of the quality of a river habitat. So in my book, I look at, as I said, about a dozen cities that I think are doing the most interesting work on this. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I'm going to just give you a flavor of one, which I've mentioned already, and that's Rotterdam. And Rotterdam's interest in child-friendly planning started about 15 years ago, when there was a survey that showed that Rotterdam was the worst city in the Netherlands to bring up a child. And the city's leaders realized that was a big problem. And since then have invested millions of euros and a lot of time and energy into transforming its built fabric. So again, I've got a sort of district level case study for you. This is a really partnership program where a lot of interventions and partners emerged to weave improvements in public space, in schoolyards, playgrounds, traffic calming, greening streets, that both improve the offers in this district and improve children's mobility. A couple of images. Here's some nice traffic calming in that district. One of the features that actually has become embedded in policy is that where possible, Rotterdam aims to reconfigure parking in a street so as to widen pavements and allow for a kind of doorstep social and play space. We're seeing some examples here on the left of a car park that's been converted into playable public space. And there are parallel programs in other parts of the city, for instance, downtown, that also aim to animate and make more playful civic spaces. And here is, again, here's an image of a schoolyard that's been given a kind of green makeover and is also open outside of school hours for public use. In terms of policy, there's a well developed neighborhood scale planning process that looks at where are the busy streets, where's the space, where are their gaps, and how can they be filled. And that actually also reminds us that children and families don't live in cities, they live in neighborhoods. So it's the neighborhood scale that we need to be focusing on. And the nice coda or finishing story to Rotterdam is that it did indeed find that the neighborhoods where it was piloting these initiatives were neighborhoods where increasing numbers of families were moving in. So I devote a whole chapter to Rotterdam, and you can perhaps see why. Turning to the UK, well, it's a mixed picture and on balance, nowhere near as advanced as in some other cities. It's worth pointing out that there are differences between England and the other nations. I'm not going to dwell on those too much now, but they're documented in a nice report from the RTPI. I'm going to just talk a bit about the London Plan, which is probably, in policy terms, the document that's gone the furthest. There's a summary of the key features of London Plan Policy S4, which focuses on children's play and mobility. And actually, again, you can see nice mapping from those bullet points back to the two-dimensional framework that I mentioned over. And the new version of the London Plan actually puts these points into policy. They used to be kind of lost in secondary documents. So what we haven't yet seen is the impact of this this policy. And I'll come back to what I think is important in getting policy to bite a bit later on. But here's some images of some places in London. On the left, King's Crescent, an award-winning regeneration scheme. On the right, a part of the Olympic Park. Here is Tumbling Bay Playground in the park, which is a very prominent and successful destination space, and another bit of the Olympic Park with a quite striking publicly open climbing wall. And there's an interesting historical scheme to look at, which is a sort of retrofit in the EC1 New Deal for Communities area in Islington. A couple of schemes from outside London. This is Goldsmith Road in Ipswich. Parking configured around the edge of the estate of this council house scheme. Marmalade Lane in Cambridge, also opening a smaller scheme, but opens up the public realm between the houses for social use. And finally, an interesting set of interventions in North Wales, in Conway, that also show a creative approach to the public realm. So just a few final slides, thinking about how we get this all to happen. I hope this is obvious, but these are not technical problems in the first case. They're really about facing up to questions about who and what cities and public spaces are for. Those are moral questions, they're political questions. And so, for instance, questions about who and what streets are for, I think, are central to opening up the public realm for those who are not just car drivers. Now, I mentioned policies earlier, but I really want to emphasize the importance of people in all of this. Time and again, in the municipalities that I looked at, and I was really taking a municipal focus, in the local authorities, the good things that happened were happening because one person, or maybe two or three, became a champion and a catalyst for the broader work. And I'll show you a model in a second that brings that out. But I also saw a lot of opportunistic activity. This is not a mainstream agenda. So it really does need people to look out for instance, regeneration programs, transport policies and initiatives on which you can hook a child-friendly layer. And I'm going to just close with a final thought about children as a unifying lens. So my model is what I call a hub and spoke model for change. And you can see at the heart of this model is a person, but that person links out to various activities and functions around planning and transport, around involvement and engagement. There's a lot I could say about that. Has a clear focus on residential neighborhoods, involves and is a catalyst for investment in space and mobility, and ideally has some data function as well. And actually that's something where a lot of municipalities still could do a much better job. But I would say this model doesn't only apply in a local authority context, it also, I think, applies for design and planning practices as well, where having a champion is really a great value. So my kind of closing message is, as I've said, all of this I think is really it's about facing up to the moral and political challenges of cities and their future. And there's a quote. This quote didn't actually make it into my book, but perhaps it'll make it into the second edition. It's a researcher from Norway talking about how it's obvious that, for instance, child-friendly places are greener than car-dominated places. But the insight here is that talking about children and bringing children into the frame, if you like, is a way of opening up debate and pushing the envelope of what's possible, and also helps to make us realize that when we're thinking about child friendliness, it's not just a tool for creating more inclusive and healthier places. It's also a way to help cities and towns respond to the really serious challenges that we're going to be facing in the climate crisis. So that's the whistle-stop tour of the book, and thank you very much. I look forward to discussing it.
Thank you, Tim. We have a message in the chat for you.
Yeah.
She says, "Oh, do I sound very echoey?"
You're okay with me?
I'm okay with you. Good. So we have one message in the chat from Louise Wicks. Louise, would you like to unmute and ask Tim directly?
Thanks, Maura. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Tim. Thanks ever so much for a fantastic presentation. When you mentioned about the survey that was done and Rotterdam came out as the worst in the Netherlands, I appreciate that was 15 years ago. But I just wondered if you knew of any, or the panel knew of any comparative surveys done in the UK, because I was thinking even locally in the BOBMK area, if a lot of the work I do is about looking into infrastructure investment, and often we don't have a lot of money, and so we are forced sometimes to prioritize. And actually having surveys that could kind of understand where are the desirable areas and where perhaps the least desirable areas, it isn't necessarily about comparing them, but I was really struck by the trigger that caused Rotterdam to actually relook at it. So yeah, if you've got any thoughts on that.
I don't know of any surveys that quite do that. Interestingly, in Wales, I mentioned Welsh policy, local authorities have a duty to assess and provide for play. It's called a play sufficiency duty. And some local authorities have, as part of that, done a kind of benchmarking process where they have surveyed children for their views. I know Wrexham is one, but I don't know, the nearest I can think of is not quite at the municipal level, but interestingly, RSPB, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, I think, did some work some years back now on connection to nature and surveyed children. And interestingly, they found, contrary to what you might think, that there was a slightly higher scores around connection to nature in more urban children than in more rural children. And from memory, it was because rural children are often, extremely dependent upon the parental taxi service to get anywhere, whereas in more urban areas, children have that a bit more mobility, and so they can do things like get to their local park or green space. But I don't think that was a very fine-grained study. Actually, you've also just made me realize there's also Natural England do the Monitor of Engagement of the Natural Environment, MENE, and there has been some work on children and families' access to nature in that. For instance, it's shown poorer levels of access in more deprived areas, and also differences between Black, Asian, and minority ethnic families and others. But it's nothing like the Dutch. It would be great to have that sort of that level of granularity, but I don't know of anything like that.
Thank you. That's all very interesting, though. Thanks.
Great. So that's great, Tim. Thank you very much for that. Very enlightening. So now we move on to Professor Marketta Peter from Finland. Marketta works in land use planning in Aalto University in Finland, and her work concentrates on research with public participation, methodology studying themes like environment, health, promotion, social sustainability, age and child-friendly environments, and participatory planning, and obviously much more to boot, I should think. So I'd like to pass over to Marketta, and Marketta will be talking to us about, child-friendly living environments and the introduction of the Bullaby model. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maura, and best wishes from the border zone between Finland and Russia, where our summer cottage happens to locate. We have had gorgeous tropical days here, but today is a little bit cloudy. And thank you very much for the invitation to this great workshop. Let me try to share my screen now. So you already heard the title of my talk, and maybe I can just mention from my background that I have a little bit unusual background for a professor of land use planning, because I am originally a psychologist, more closely environmental psychologist, and I've been interested in this human aspect in planning and design throughout my career. Very long time ago, that was back in the end of 1990s, when I started to think about my PhD. And that was about children and environments. I started to think that, is it so that environments have somehow dramatically changed from that kind of situation what was when I was a child, have the childhood of modern children become somehow fenced. It started to feel like modern children are spending a lot of more time than the generations before indoors with parents and without independent access or possibility to wander in the environment. So I was imagining that maybe a change like that could have happened. And I actually learned that there is literature regarding children's independent mobility restrictions, and that already the research had identified by then already both individual level and societal problems related to restrictions in children's independent mobility. So I thought that clearly children's independent mobility would be one essential dimension of environmental child friendliness. But when I developed my thinking a bit further, and especially when I started to use as a theoretical background, James Gibson's ecological perceptual psychology, I realized that both children's possibility, opportunities to engage in the environment, to find interesting possibilities, affordances in the environment, and the independent mobility possibilities together perhaps form a child-friendly setting. And when I combined these two dimensions, I got the model that Tim already presented you. And in this model, actually the only child-friendly situation is represented in a Bullerby type of setting that provides both high independent mobility possibilities and high number of environmental affordances. All the other types of environments represent clear compromises in environmental child friendliness. And maybe I can a little bit explain what this peculiar word affordance actually means. Well, it's a very unique concept developed by James Gibson, and it refers to the unique ways we all perceive environment through our own spectacles. And these spectacles are really influenced by our corporality. So imagine how different if different spectacles we have. For example, if our mobility is severely restricted, or if you are smaller than bigger. For example, here is how a child of my colleague, he's in this case 2 years old, is searching for the affordances or possibilities of an urban environment in a city of Melbourne. So as you can see, this little person uses his body in a very creative way to find different possibilities for activities that interest him. And these activities and these affordances and these possibilities are not only in a playground or in places specially designed for children. They can be everywhere if children only are allowed to find those possibilities. So why did I use, or let's say, what does this Bullerby actually mean? Well, if you think that it has to include possibilities both for independent mobility and these possibilities to perceive environment as a rich and fascinating collection of possibilities that are very intriguing to you, then what happens is some kind of positive cycle. The more you see environment as fascinating, the more motivated you are to move around. The more you move around, the more possibilities you find. So in this kind of setting, there can be that kind of positive cycle. And why did I called this setting a Bullerbü? Tim had found another concept here, but this is how I originally named it, because I was inspired by books of Astrid Lindgren, the Swedish writer who also wrote about Pippi Longstocking, you probably know. And in her books about Bullerby, that literally means noise village or noisy village. In that village, children were really part of everyday life. They were involved in all daily activities of that village. They had also duties that can be seen as important set of affordances. There were many social affordances, children not only playing with their with other children of their age, but children of all ages, and with grandmothers and grandfathers, everybody. And this Bullerby also involved risks. But children learned to live with those risks because they were developing their competencies simultaneously. So let me take one more example of this model in addition to Bullerby. Well, class house represent a situation where children have mobility restrictions, but despite them, they still perceive environment as rich source of affordances. And this can happen if, for example, children learn about the world through the safety seat of a car or through media. But the thing is that they don't have independent access to explore the world, but it is more the information from environment is more based on second-hand information. So I did take this up because I'm afraid that this is a type of environment where a lot of modern children are living in. So when I did my PhD, I used this model to compare different settings in Finland and in Belarus. And I actually compared different levels of urbanization. And I learned that the settings that I studied differed, or this model managed to differ them quite clearly. And here I studied 8-year-old children and found that perhaps the closest to the Bullerby setting in this case was Finnish rural village. But let me come back to this result later, a bit later. And I'm just I just want to say that I'm so happy, super happy and proud to learn that this model has been useful also in practical work targeting to design child-friendly settings. It's wonderful. So maybe you could think that this model could be used not only to evaluate environmental child-friendliness, but as a more general model of human-friendly environment. I actually think that the dimensions of socially sustainable environment do not really dramatically differ from these two basic dimensions. And if you think about, if you ask children themselves, Tim or actually referred to this study too by Louise Wicks that has been realized in all continents, and where children themselves were asked about both the positive and negative social qualities and physical qualities of environment. You get a rich set of criteria. And I am, of course, more interested perhaps in these physical characteristics because of my profession of land use planning professor. And what is interesting is that children did name the two dimensions that my model is about in this study, but there are other aspects, and but I would still argue that these are very fundamental aspects, and some of the other aspects actually come along if you deeply study these two dimensions that I have done. And out of these two dimensions, independent mobility, I would argue, is more severely threatened in the modern world or in urban settings, because I would say that children are very creative in finding affordances if they are only allowed to search for them. So this study was again mentioned by Tim, and here 16 different countries were compared in the degree of children's independent mobility. And as Tim mentioned, Finland performed best here. But even in Finland, where children's independent mobility is exceptionally high, we cannot be very happy about the current situation, because the decrease in children's independent mobility has been clear also in Finland, as you can see in this picture, within about 20 years. From 90s to 2010. And what is interesting perhaps is that this decrease has been especially significant in countryside, not so much in cities at all. There the decrease hasn't been statistically significant. So nowadays, we have been busy in my team developing a new kind of methodology, new kind of place-based approach to study children's environments, but also many other age groups. And we have done many interesting studies using this public participation GIS approach, where you ask people to map places, significant or personally meaningful places. And at the same time, you can create a whole new knowledge layer, like map-based or place-based knowledge that can easily be used in design and planning practice. So we have been able to collect with these online tools that have now been actually used in more than 35 countries. We have successfully managed to collect data also from children and young people, often from 1,000 children or 2,000 children, and it's clear that children have a lot to say about their immediate surroundings, and that knowledge can be effectively used in planning. And we, for example, found that when we repeated the Bullerby study in city of Turku in Finland, we learned a little bit surprising result that Bullerby was found in a rather densely built environment, not in the outskirts of the city. And we were wondering, why do we get that kind of result? One reason could be that here we are talking about a bit older children, not 8-year-olds anymore, but 11 to 14 years children. And also it can be that young families who have moved to the outskirts of a city have backed their very urban lifestyle with them, which may have led to the situation that children's eyes do not open up to those immediate affordances that the nearby forests, for example, provide, because they are busy being transported to their judo and ballet lessons. So Tim also referred to this kind of phenomenon himself. So we have also found something like that in Finland. We have used this approach, mapping children's school routes and also compare the situation in Finland and Japan, where children have mapped their meaningful places. And we found some interesting differences. For example, that in Finland, the average distance to these meaningful places were twice as long than in Japan. And we found some other interesting differences between the two countries. For example, that in Finland, more social and positive and emotional affordances were mapped, while in Japan more functional affordances were mapped. We found, and then we studied something we call behavior settings, clusters of affordances that are meaningful not only to one child, but a group of children. And we asked the experts to go to those places that are important to many children, and we found that again some interesting differences between the countries. For example, that in both countries, outdoor settings shared with other user groups dominated as these kind of clusters important for children. And but indoor and commercial settings were perceived most positively, and traffic areas most negatively. And then there were some country-specific differences too. For example, that in Finland, surprise, surprise, natural settings were mapped more often, and in Japan, commercial, recreational, and religious settings more often. One example of behavior setting, this kind of cluster of affordances, is a shopping center. You might be surprised that shopping center can be very important, meaningful place for several children. But actually, we made some kind of meta study comparing the places important to different age groups. And we actually found that for the older the person was, the more often positive places were located in green areas. And for younger people, actually commercial land use and sports and recreational areas were more common than for older persons. Maybe a few more points. I know I'm coming end of my time. Well, it is important that this kind of place-based knowledge can be easily used in planning and design, because it can be integrated to the existing systems that the planners use, namely GIS systems. For example, here is a case from city of Lahti, Finland, where they collected a wonderful data set from all daycare centers in a city to ask, where are the places children go to, or the natural areas where they go as part of their daycare activities. And the city wanted to protect these areas from forest department to cutting these trees down, and also to protect the routes children take to these natural settings. We have now one ongoing research, which is called the Free Ride, where we are studying whether the free public transport actually increases or decreases children's physical activity and independent mobility. So this study is ongoing, and I cannot really yet tell you many results. My final notion is that I have two dreams regarding child-friendly environment research still, and what I would like to study in the near future is how environment supports the social well-being of children. I think that has been a quite neglected theme, while we have concentrate very much on, for example, the study of what kind of environments promote physical activity and physical health. But the social dimensions of health have been neglected, and surely now during pandemic, the social isolation and loneliness of children and young people have probably become a big issue in many countries. Another theme I would love to study is this question whether the criteria of child-friendly environment need some kind of update in the era of climate change. That would be another dream. It would be wonderful to have an international study about this theme. So I will leave this now. Sorry if I exceeded my time a little bit. Could have happened. Thank you very much.
No, that's absolutely fine, Marketta. We're a bit ahead of time anyway, so it wasn't a problem. So it's good to hear your studies and your models and all that interesting stuff that you've obviously got a very big passion for. So now we are going to move over to Rosa. Some of you may well know Rosa. She works at Oxford City Council as a senior urban designer and is on the BOBMK steering group. She's really helped to sort of pull this together with her background. She's got quite a lot of knowledge of this area and of people that work within this area. So one thing that we really wanted to look at was how local authorities are looking at child-friendly design and, you know, what's actually happening. So Rosa's done a little bit of research locally. I don't know if you want to refer to the polls first, Rosa, to just give an overview and a sort of a response to what people's feelings were towards those questions. And yeah, so Rosa's hailed from public practice in London. She's been with us at City Council, working across many projects now for a good 12 months, and has been involved in all sorts of different areas. And obviously with her previous experience in London, has got a very good range of experience and viewpoints here. So if I hand over to Rosa and she can talk you through what you feel in the polls, and then obviously all her insights and experience and ideas for the future, really. Over to you, Rosa.
Thanks, Maura. Yeah, I'll just add, just before joining the City Council, I worked at ZCV Architects with Dinah Bornat, who, as Tim mentioned, is a sort of a really big, important champion of child-friendly cities and towns. So yeah, and at the office we did, it was a really strong focus there. Yeah, so the poll was very interesting. Thanks to everyone for doing that. Interesting to know there's not enough understanding. So I hope that after today we can start to build on that. Particularly interesting was that everyone's clearest, the majority of people's clearest or favourite, best memory of playing out was playing outside without adults. So that just tells us how important that is. And obviously it's difficult because we don't know how old the people were who telling us how old they were when they first walked to school on their own. But we do know statistically that's getting later and later. I think I recently read that children now are walking to school 2 years later than their parents' generation, which is, it's quite significant. Anyway, I will get on with my presentation. So I'm going to look at how we might achieve child-friendly planning in the child-friendly design within the planning process. Let's see, we're going to go forward. Is it stuck? Here we go. Okay, so in this presentation, I will quickly recap on why we need child-friendly cities. And thanks to Tim and Marketta for so brilliantly explaining that. How we can use existing policy to see more of this, and what we've been doing in Oxford, and what the next steps we might take are. Okay, so briefly, why is it important? Outdoor play is fundamental to children's immediate well-being and long-term development, specifically outdoor free play, mobility that isn't supervised by adults. And we've seen a huge decline of this in the last 40 years. And also, what does it look like? These are the four things that I kind of have in the back of my mind when I'm looking at a pre-app. And so what does it look like? It looks car free. Tim gave a brilliant example of that. Or certainly, traffic calmed or less cars. Connected. So that means a sort of a chain of spaces, and including safe crossing points, and also visually connected, so you can see all the way down and less likely to get lost. Accessible, that means easy access to spaces from dwellings, so not having to cross a road or several roads. And really what we want is doorstep play for everyone. And importantly, these places need to be overlooked. Children like being seen in the public realm because it protects them from harm, it protects them from bullying, and also people like seeing children in the public realm. So okay, so before I get into policy, I'll just quickly say that UK planning systems do have an obligation to meet these needs, as they are enshrined in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which says the child has a right to be heard and taken seriously in all matters affecting them. Child has a right to gather and use public space, and does have a right to play, rest, leisure, and access cultural life, and to participate in places linking participation in process to participation in outcome. So that's engaging in the planning process. And so what policy do we actually have at the moment? Dinah and others' review of planning in 2019 states children are most notable in the UK planning policy through their absence, which is pretty shocking. So there's no national policy, and there are a few regional ones. Tim mentioned some in London. So yeah, there's a few regional and local ones, but nothing national. But let's not despair. What do we have, or what have I been using? There is the NPPF, doesn't mention children specifically, but is very keen to see sustainable development. So open spaces that support communities' health, social and cultural well-being, which I think chimes with what Marketta and Tim have been talking about. And chapter 8, promote healthy and safe communities, which, as we can see, a community that is children playing out is present for everyone. So what we're looking for is something that's safe, accessible, and that can enable and support healthy lifestyles. What else is there? There's manual for streets. Now this does mention children 3 times, which is something unfortunately once is negative. So manual for streets very helpfully states the importance of local children being able to walk and cycle from all parts of the development, school, parks and open space. Unfortunately, they are seen as a nuisance in the wrong place. But more importantly, a street design which accommodates the needs of children and disabled people is likely to suit most, if not all, user types, which I think resonates with the idea that children are generators of community life. If we design for children, we're designing for everyone. Building for Healthy Life also has some specific, which is quite a new policy, as I think active travel and children's wellbeing is climbing up the agenda. So that's really positive. I won't read all those ones out. And Oxford Local Plan, we are doing lots on high quality design and placemaking. So we want roads, streets and paths that link up. So that addresses connectivity and travelling through the site. We want external public spaces, the streets and parks overlooked. So that addresses visibility and overlooking. Policy M1, prioritising walking, cycling and public transport. So again, permeable and safe to walk through, direct connections. This is all, moving towards, creating more child-friendly places, ensure footways that are sufficiently wide. Policy M6, which is brilliant. We're trying to get as many car-free developments as possible. I think it is unfortunately very difficult to achieve because it's just complicated. And the zero emission zone, which is great. So now I will talk about I'll give 3 examples of how I've used those policies to try and make housing schemes more child friendly, specifically through the pre-app process. This is Frieswide Farm. So on the left is the previously quite convoluted plan, not easy to navigate, poor visual connections through the site, little or no direct access to green spaces. You can see this one in the corner, the bottom right here has very little overlooking, and it's got roads on the other 2 sides. Weak connection beyond the red line of the site. So we couldn't tell how would a child get to the school or anywhere else. It was very much a cul-de-sac site. They weren't keen on connecting to the adjoining future developments. So by the end of the pre-app process, this is the one they submitted to planning. It's a much more simplified plan. So it's much more legible for kids and everyone. So it's harder to get lost. Much more direct access to green spaces without having to cross roads. The central one in the middle, you've got direct access from those houses and all of those blocks as well. And then the green spaces form routes. So we're encouraging play on the way. It's not kind of just a dead end, go to the playground and stay there. The idea is that the route goes through the whole site and then beyond where schools and other services are. And there's much more overlooking, and they've also got shared spaces. Another one is Hillview Farm in Marsden. The one on the left, bottom left, this is the one they started with. So they do have a green space in the middle, but it's very much dominated by sort of the need for the car to get around. The car can pretty much get everywhere. And we felt there was no hierarchy or difference between the road types or between sort of different parts of the site. And then, so what we really encouraged them to do was sort of properly give pedestrians and cyclists a priority. As you can see on the right, the road in front of the flats, which behind them is the ring road, which is pretty tough for them. So we pushed for them to make this pedestrianised. There's a few crossings to get to the car parking, but this is sort of effectively a long play street now, or a cycle route, or just somewhere for those people in the flats and the whole estate, well, the whole development, to come out and play there, or just enjoy meeting their neighbours. And then the Greenway meant that sort of provided a way of connecting up the other green spaces in the site. And we're pleased to say that the ODRP recognised that the Greenway was giving this development a lot of character that it was missing. And as you can see, their 3D image visualization at the bottom right there. They were, you know, once they sort of realised that, oh, okay, giving this a nice, get some character and placemaking is really important, and it becomes a selling point for them. So, you know, certainly I would encourage you to point that out to developers. You know, this is helping them. This Blackbird Leads, this is still in the pre-app process, so no final images here, just these that are publicly available. 2 sites, the district centre and Knights Road. So both of those we've encouraged as much direct access to the open space as possible. It has been difficult because of issues with highways and bus manoeuvring, but you know, we've pushed as much as we can, increase connections through, so that's the wider estate, and then also on the smaller scale as well. We always making the case for more neighbourliness, so having houses and blocks of flats facing each other and celebrating the space in between. Knights Park, which is a smaller one here at the bottom, we tried very hard to make this car free, but we couldn't manage it, unfortunately. But we have increased overlooking as much as possible, and the sales team for Knights Park were very, very, very reluctant to put kitchens at the front of the plan. They felt that wouldn't be sellable, because I guess it's more traditional to have them at the back. That's what they felt. But we, in a meeting with Secure by Design, which I would say a sort of friend and foe, but Secure by Design, although technically an active room is a living room or a kitchen, Secure by Design were happy to agree with us that the kitchen provides much more surveillance. It's much more of an active room than a sitting room where you'll have people facing away from the street, watching telly or, you know, relaxing. So that has been progress, getting kitchens at the front. And now I'll just talk briefly about other things that are happening in our region and nationally as well. So as we sort of come out of the COVID pandemic, we have seen a huge push for active travel. As we all know, we've been discouraged to use public transport, and so driving is taken off. So this is our opportunity to make more space for people for walking and cycling, which is definitely very positive. This is low traffic neighbourhoods. I'm sure everyone's sort of experienced these in one way or another. A way to try and reclaim quieter roads from cars and vans taking shortcuts on these streets, which has seen a particular rise since 2008, which was the launch of the iPhone 3G, and also sat-navs, which is why you've got all these rat running and people taking shortcuts through back streets. But I would say, obviously, I'm sure everybody knows, LTNs have been very controversial and certainly not universally popular, or some would say beneficial. Although primarily they are intended to encourage active travel for all, particularly children on their route to school, for example. So the idea is that if you can stop the rat running in the back streets, you are providing a bit of a, somewhere quieter and calmer and safer for children to start walking to school and cycling again. We've also seen lots of temporary traffic regulation orders, lots of these across the country. So that specific streets are shut rather than a network. We've seen in LTNs. And recently in Oxford City, the TTRA has been approved for Broad Street, which is really exciting. The main objective was to provide a more open space in the city centre. So this will be the largest public square in Oxford, which I'm sure everybody knows doesn't have that much open public space in the middle of the city. So it's creating a large space for people to come back into the city after lockdown. And we'll say this does include the benefit of creating a space where as Councillor Tom Hayes says here, children will be able to play. So there's a huge advantage of managing the traffic. Another final example here, school streets and play streets, also temporary road closures. So school streets offer a proactive solution for schools to tackle air pollution, poor health, road danger, and reduce road danger. So they're encouraging children to walk to school and discouraging their parents to drive them to school. And this is play streets on the other side, which I know is happening a lot in Charwell. So this is a resident-led scheme, which might happen every month or in some cases every week, where you close your street to traffic and let the children play out on the street. And playing right outside their front door is very important because they learn about their environment directly. Okay, so I would like to think that we're doing quite a lot. You know, lots is happening, but is it enough? Are we really upholding the rights of the child as set out by the UNCRC and equalities legislation? And let's face it, attitudes to car ownership and driving are highly fraught for many people. As we can see this image of the LTN, sort of anti-LTN people here. Housing supply in this country is problematic. So unlike European cities where they're probably more driven by the city councils themselves, here we're relying on developers to be responsive and collaborative, which can be difficult because there are a lot of things that need to be covered. You know, there's a lot of priorities that we need to go through. And so what's happening without specific policy, children are not recognised as a distinct group. And this made me think, imagine if we didn't recognise people with disabilities as a distinct group and sort of acknowledge that we need to think about, you know, their needs. I think it would be absolutely shocking. So it is important to recognise that children are a distinct group, and also that there are differences between them. There's a huge difference between early years and teenagers. And just say, I haven't even mentioned the need for teenagers to hang out, which is really important, but you know, this is a huge topic. Children and youth services and planning is not as joined up as they could be, and children are not routinely engaged in the process, which policy may help with. Though getting national policy is key, I would say, I'm really pleased to say that incorporating more specifics about child-friendly design is being discussed in the upcoming Oxford Local Plan and the Oxfordshire Plan. And there is, in the planning white paper, talking nationally, there is I know, a move to where they're discussing engaging with young people and children more, but we know that that's, who knows what's going to happen with that. So I hope I've shown in my presentation that though there is quite a way to go, the pre-act process and existing policy, as well as road closure and traffic calming schemes, child-friendly design is moving up the agenda, and we are seeing green shoots. So I think it is really positive and exciting, but there's lots to do. And so, but we should remember that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So let's keep going, really. Okay, there we are.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Rosa.
Thank you.
And, you know, Rosa and I have been talking to different people, and unfortunately, as we know, different people couldn't arrive and weren't available at this time because there's some friends of yours, aren't there, that are working on some project that's very busy for the whole summer that said to us they could come back in September as well.
Oh yeah, yeah, exactly. Oxfordshire playing out. They're doing lots. They're organising a whole. Well, they're trying to a few full of activities over the summer, lockdown willing. But yeah, they were too busy to come because obviously summer is a busy time for playing out. But yeah, do definitely look them up. Oxfordshire Player Association. That's really great.
But it's good to know that organisations like that are so busy implementing all these strategies and groups and things of that nature that they are too busy to come at this time of year, which shows that, you know, there is quite a lot of active things going on. specifically in Oxfordshire. And I think what we'd like to probably do today is if it's possible, is to, you know, discuss with, you know, our members here from different local authorities, you know, how you feel things are going in your area. Are you, you know, moving positively forward? Do you need more support? Obviously, Rose has identified lots of different things just really across Oxford and Oxfordshire, not any further afield of, you know, what's happening locally for us. So it would be great for the rest of the network to just, you know, give us some examples. I see we've got some little pieces in chat from Felicity talking about how the Clarendon Centre planning is going and how they're looking to also introduce play area is in there. And Rachel's also talking about what we're doing for policy. I don't know, Felicity, if you could give us a little bit more insight into that application to just give people a bit of information about how we're working on that and what you've managed to achieve.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Yeah, so I'm currently dealing with a new application for the Clarendon Centre. As we know, it's been covered over since the mid-80s. The application now is to take the roof off and redefine the centre as public streets. So it won't be a shopping centre anymore. And part of that in the centre is a new public open square. And part of that, we have more greening, lots of trees, incidental play, where they're looking at boulders for children to sit and people to play on, but the kids can, you know, climb on. We've got a slightly undulating floor surface where it'll connect into the suds drainage. So when it rains, the water will cascade down the side of the building through rills and fill up to create puddles in the centre of the space there. So yeah, very exciting, very interesting. We're still during the application process and probably looking for a decision sort of later this year on that. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you, Felicity. Has anyone else got some examples that they'd like to share with the group, or has anyone got any further questions that they'd like put forward to our panel of speakers today, please? In the meantime, Rosa, is there anything that you think that you could discuss while we wait to see if any more Q&A comes forward?
Well, I mean, I think it's a big subject, isn't it? I think we didn't really talk about teenagers playing out, but the UN Convention does recognise that they have a right to be out, and I think it's such a shame that they're almost demonised. I would say that we don't, you know, the idea that if they're hanging around the streets, just sort of hanging out with their friends and just being idle, is that we just assume they're up to something, whereas teenagers all over the world, it's just how they behave. It's sort of it's part of human development. It's this need to just hang out and do not much really with your friends rather. But I guess, Marketta, that's why you did mention shopping centres, and I suppose that's the role they play, don't they?
Yeah, actually, we have studied quite a lot these teenage children, and I only mentioned shopping center because it appeared in the data, that is not to say, you know, how things are, how they ought to be. I think in Finland we have still during the recent years built far too many shopping centers, even in brand new areas, which I think personally is a huge mistake, and I'm very unhappy about that. But it is natural that teenagers want to spend time in shopping centers if there's nothing else. And of course, in our climate, these indoor places are quite tempting places, attractive places to spend time and hang around with friends. And some of the shopping centers have developed quite good open spaces that are not commercial spaces, for example, climbing areas. And that is, of course, better than doing nothing. But commenting to Felicity's example, I think it sounded fascinating to put the, if I understood correctly, the running water, like rainwater stream through the central public space. And we know that children simply love water and water play and other natural elements. For some reason, seem to include way more affordances than any built structures, because those built structures are very quickly, blade, I don't know if you can say blade through, you have done everything that is programmed tens of times, but with some simple natural elements, like a little hill, for example, it seems to include endless opportunities, endless affordances.
Thank you, Marketta. And we also have a question from Lucy. Lucy, would you like to ask your question? And Tim, would you like to take the question from Lucy, please? Are you there, Lucy? Or maybe Lucy's not there to be able to talk to us. Would you just be able to answer her question to everybody anyway, please, Tim?
Oh, and I've just put it in the chat. I would start look around at what there is. I've put a link to the London plan, and policy S4 is the policy that I quoted in my slides. Of course, you need to think about how it might apply in a different context and what you think you can persuade your local authority to sign up to and also interpret it to that different context. But I think it's a pretty good starting point. There is, I think, some housing guidance. Rosa, you may know about that, or certainly Dinah Bornat is working on and has fed into housing guidance with the Gill. I've slightly lost track of where that's got to, but I think it's in the pipeline. Rosa's quite right. In the absence of a sort of supportive push from central government, it's tough. But I mean, if you don't have any local policy, then I'm guessing, Rosa, you were talking about Knights Park in Blackbird Leys, and you're saying you couldn't get a sort of car-free dimension. Presumably that's because you were pushing for that, and the developers pushed back, and you knew you'd lose it if it went to a planning tribunal, or
yeah,
basically.
Yeah, it's very difficult.
So, yeah. And I've heard similar stories, different topics, but I know it's hard, but I guess what I would say is there are now developers coming forward who are really interested in this. I'm sure they're a minority section, but I mentioned Marmalade Lane, which is developed by Town. Now, Town are working on a development of 1,000. They are the lead developer for a 1,000-unit development in North Cambridge. And there's lots of reason that there are factors about that site that really make it an obvious site for a more or less car-free development. So it'd be really interesting to see what comes out of that. There are developers like you and I, Urban Splash. I know these are more in kind of bigger urban areas, and they're quite big long-term, public-private partnerships in effect. But I think they show a growing interest from the development community. You're absolutely right, Rosa. We can't rely on them, but we can, amongst other things, cultivate and support the most progressive. And I mean, I love the example you showed from Fry's Wide Farm. I don't know if that illustration, if that image could be put into the public domain, but if you'll pardon my French, one of the Twitter feeds that I follow is somebody who tweets under the name planning shit. And I think probably Rosa, you might see it as well. Honestly, it's so grim. It's just a sort of, well, I won't dwell on it, but to be able to sort of respond by saying, look, it's not all bad news. Here is an example of a scheme that was really rubbish, and now we've made it a bit better. And these sketches are in the public domain. You're not breaking any commercial confidentiality. I don't know if this is the case, but if it were the case, I think that's all that we've learned from playground design tells us that if you can show positive examples of what can be done, those people who are already minded to push, for change and to try and get the best for kids will be encouraged, and they will find support and solidarity. So it's really helpful to get those good examples put into the public domain.
And on this one, Tim, and also we'd like to probably get Marketta on it as well. Louise has asked, can we also discuss the benefits that adults will experience from child-friendly cities, apart from happy children?
Yes, I would love to discuss that. I think it's a great question. And of course, there is this old notion of, or old saying that what's good for children is good for all. Yes, but of course we have to question that, whether that is true, like what adults really benefit. Well, I would say that yes, the essential characteristics of socially sustainable, health promoting environment are exactly those criteria that promote a child-friendly environment too. So, and we have studied empirically this. For example, this kind of middle density that promotes children independent mobility also promotes physical active lifestyle of aging population. And we have learned that even in the situation where older people don't have any positive attitudes towards active mobility or taking care of themselves, their own well-being, still they benefit a lot in living in that kind of moderate, dense neighborhood, and they perceive their health better. And we have even found out that when people move from from one type of environment to this moderate density setting, they change their behavior, and actually their attitudes follow. So, so these characteristics of physical environment nudge you behave in a more healthy way. And what is best is that really what benefits human health also benefits planetary health. So I think we should be pretty convinced that child-friendly environment promotes human friendly and, let's say, planetary health.
Great. So thank you, Claire, for bringing up LTNs, and obviously they've been covered in Rosa's presentation. James has also brought up the subject of LTNs, who works in infrastructure for Oxford County Council. So James, do you think you could ask your question? Tim, Rosa, don't know which one of you maybe is best to talk about LTNs with James.
Hi, sorry, I don't know if it's a question. I think it was just a point, really, that
okay.
The LTNs as a example has thrown up the difficult choices that we have to make about how we use our roads going forward, and our existing streets in particular. And there's a lot of people for, a lot of people against, and there's quite a vocal element against, saying they inconvenience people, etc., and it's causing problems around them, etc. I suppose the other point is about that they need to be seen as a holistic strategy across a wider area because of the potential knock-on impacts as well. But it does, as I say, it does sort of raise a question about what are our streets for going forward? Who are they for, and how are they designed, and who should have priority in using them? And I did some training around healthy streets and the healthy streets approach recently, and it is just an interesting point to reflect on who our streets are for, and it's a problem. It's been a problem in Oxford for years because we've got a limited number of streets and roads, and having to make those decisions about priority, about who uses them, how we use them. So probably a question, I suppose, or the question would be about, is there examples from elsewhere where we've had that has been that debate and arguments, and we come out the other end with a slightly different outcome, I suppose, in terms of how streets are used.
I think I agree. It's really, really complicated. What I find, most people are familiar with the argument that it reduces, it's better for air quality, but that's really easy to defeat that argument because they say, oh, but it's just making traffic jams over there. But I think because children aren't talked about enough, because it's not in policy and it's not like a national policy, I think the argument, it kind of comes much further down the line, down the list of sort of, oh, but we're making a route for children, we're making streets for children so they don't have to be driven to school. But maybe, you know, if they were recognised as distinct routes and we were talking about them properly, perhaps you could say, well, LTNs are for children, you know, as well as air pollution. And it might be, you know, it's harder to argue against, I think. But I agree, it's very, very complicated.
Yeah, I mean, children have come into it.
They do come into it, but not a bit later. I feel like it's sort of, air pollution is right at the top. Children do come in, but sort of, you know, a bit further down the list. But you just have the arguments about air pollution, and people say, well, I'm taking longer to get somewhere, so pollution is just as bad. It's like, well, maybe, you know, it's more, I don't know, I don't know. I agree, it's very, very complicated.
I think it really is worth emphasising that bringing children's voices and, if you like, stake in all this into the debate about mobility it cannot help but add weight to the move for active travel and you know, and be a more effective response to climate change, all the rest of it. And I mean, but having said that, I mean, I was on a call the other week with one of these cycling mayors. So this is you know, the idea of having cycling mayors in different cities. I can't quite remember which city it was now. It was a city in mainland Europe, and I asked the question about children and children's voices, and the immediate response I got was the one that you just gave, Rosa, which is, in effect, you know, bringing children's voices in helps to lift the conversation and, you know, diffuse some of the conflict and the arguments. But, and I've put this in the chat, I have seen some examples where, you know, pro LTN people have said, look, we need to think more about children and we need to involve children and let's go into schools and talk to them. And the anti-LTN people have gone and said, well, A, what do kids know anyway, because they, you know, they're just kids, and B, the schools and, you know, the forces of darkness are just drilling them in you know, the propaganda that walking and cycling is better. So it really, and of course that's nonsense, but I do worry. I think we need to think, how do we bring children's voices in to a very contested issue, because that can be, clearly it can be quite fraught, and we already see a lot of, you know, attacks and abuse around this topic. The final thing is just to echo what I think you said, James, that really this LTNs make sense as part of a strategic move away from the car. And if you're just relying on a few maybe resident-led interventions and kind of otherwise just letting everything be the same, then that's just sets people against each other in a really unhelpful way.
Okay, and Louise, do you want to chat to Rosa about straight roads?
I can do. Thanks, Rosa, for your presentation as well. And I should also say thank you, Marketta, for your presentation and the reply you gave me in the comments. Yeah, I was just interested by the proposals that you've had going through planning and those proposals where you've shifted it more to straighter roads, appreciating that they aren't like vast, so they're not you know, kilometres and kilometres of straight roads. But in the past, there seems to have been, I apologise, I use the word fashion, and my transport colleagues will probably curse me for saying it, a trend for winding streets, because there is some rationale that it slows cars down. But I think also your point about visibility, and that's also for pedestrians, the visibility of streets, being able to see, you know, in the direction of where you're going, and it's not just about wayfinding like signs, but actually being able to see those landmarks as you pass through a space is really important. And I think the winding streets can prevent that. And I know the estate that I live on has that issue with blind bends, and children, you know, naturally are just in the middle of the roads as they walk around because there's no pavement. So I see the negatives. I do see the positives of slower traffic as well. I just wondered, on your schemes, had you received any pushback to the proposals that you'd put forward to kind of go with those quite straight boulevards?
Yeah, definitely. With Freiburg Farm, me and Felicity would have to work quite hard to convince them just to have a much simpler plan. With winding streets, you often get very wide corners, which you can zip around in the car. And with straight roads, you just use different traffic calming. So you might have pinch points, and you still want to slow the traffic down, definitely. But it doesn't have to be winding. And yes, we do get, yeah, it's not been easy, but with straight you get more, there's more possibilities for chains and linking things up. Because I agree with winding, it often builds, if you look at, you know, a children's racetrack or a racetrack, it's bendy and it's winding around. If you have to go around a proper straight corner, you're going to have to slow down and look properly. So yeah, it does take a bit of convincing, definitely.
Okay, well, we have got a comment from Toby about winding streets approached by Gordon Cullen, which you may well be familiar with as well, Rosa, with obviously a different perspective on straight and winding streets. We don't appear, I don't think, to have any final questions. So unless any of the panel have got any, oh, okay, Tim.
Just wanted to give a plug. I've been in touch with Scott Urban from Oxford Living Streets, who I dare say some of you will know, about doing a session with them on the 23rd of September. Details to be firmed up. I'm hoping it's going ahead, but I just thought I'd mention that in case people are interested.
Brilliant, thank you.
Okay, and what kind of session would that be, Tim?
Well, I think it's all being organised by Oxford Living Streets, co-hosting with Active Oxfordshire. Really, I think what he wants is a presentation from me and then some time for chat. So it won't be too different from what people have heard already, but it'll be, you know, a more community-oriented and maybe sort of sport, public health, play-oriented audience, and an Oxford focus, I guess.
Okay, that sounds great. So we can put that forward to our members if you want to sort of copy me on something like that.
I'll just check with Scott, because I'm not quite sure what their plans are for publicity, but I'll certainly ask the question. Yeah.
Sounds great. So on that line, our next webinar will be about climate change and sustainability, something our members have been asking lots about. We have speakers from RTPI, from some green organisations, and we're hoping to get a building control specialist to come and speak about how they are trying to move forward under climate change. And obviously we've got many options within climate change to bring your webinar, and that's being led by Penelope, who quite often chairs BOBMK webinars. So on that point, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you everyone for being really participatory today. It's been really great. Special thank you to Rosa, Marketta and to Tim, and for all their insights. Hopefully we can share their presentations with you all so you can study the different examples that they've shown to us. And I'll be sending out a feedback link for you all to feedback on how you felt today's gone. And anyway, hopefully see you at another webinar soon.
Thanks, Maura.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye. See you all soon.
Bye.
Paul.